participación de Rasmus Touré, que se va a conectar vía remota. Después estaremos con Peter Krieger para tener un pequeño receso. Regresaremos con Nikos Kaczynski para después iniciar con esta mesa redonda. Después habrá un tiempo para la comida que será de 1:30 a 3 de la tarde para continuar la tercera mesa de este coloquio, que será dictada o iniciada por Severin Calder y Paul Schubert del colectivo Orangutano. Después estará Kate de Jong de Titus Brandsma Institute. Después estará Paola Aguirre con Borderless. Y regresaremos después de un pequeño receso a la conferencia magistral de cierre con Eyal Weisman de Forensic Architecture. Terminando esto, también tendremos una mesa de discusión. Para ello, el día de hoy me voy a permitir presentar a los moderadores de esta mesa 2, titulada Procesos Descriptivos, que serán el profesor Daniel Dao, que quisiera saber si anda por aquí. Que lo vi hace un segundo. Y también estará Karina Albizu. Ellos son los moderadores de esta mesa. Entonces, vamos a darles unos segunditos mientras se incorporan a sus lugares para poder dar inicio. Entonces, doy la palabra a Karina para que nos presente a nuestra primera conferencista, a Sarah Williams, y inicie de esta manera la mesa. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Muy buenos días a todas, a todos, a todos. Me da un gusto enorme poder estar hoy aquí y es un verdadero honor poder presentar a la doctora Sarah Williams. Mi nombre, como dijeron anteriormente, es Karina Albizu y quiero agradecer a la Facultad de Arquitectura por esta invitación. Y bueno, la doctora Williams, para quienes ya la han escuchado o conocido antes, pues es alguien fantástica que además ha logrado cruzar disciplinas y pues hoy nos hace una presentación sobre el trabajo que desarrollan en el MIT, en el Leventhal Lab. Si me dan un segundito, ahorita leemos toda su biografía. Gracias. Ella es profesora asociada de Tecnología y Planificación Urbana en el Instituto de Tecnología de Massachusetts, MIT por sus siglas en inglés. Es directora del Civic Data Design Lab y del Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. Combina su formación en computación y diseño para crear estrategias de comunicación que expongan cuestiones de política urbana a audiencias amplias y generen un cambio cívico. Ella llama al proceso Data Action, que también es el nombre de su libro reciente publicado por el MIT Press. Fue codirectora del Laboratorio de Diseño de Información Espacial en la Escuela de Posgrado en Planificación y Preservación de la Arquitectura de la Universidad de Columbia. Su trabajo de diseño ha sido ampliamente exhibido, incluido el trabajo en el Guggenheim, el Museo de Arte Moderno MoMA, la Bienal de Venecia y el Museo Cooper Hewitt. Ha ganado numerosos premios, incluido ser nombrada una de las 25 mejores planificadoras de tecnología y Game Changer por Metropolis Magazine. Su última exposición en exhibición fue en la sede del Programa Mundial de Alimentos en Roma. Bienvenida, Sara. Muchísimas gracias.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. I first want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to join you today. As was mentioned, I'm an associate professor of technology and urban planning at MIT, and I run something called the Civic Data Design Lab and the Leventhal Center. Going to click. Are we on the slide? Perfect. Okay. We don't have a clicker, so we have new technology. It goes like that. We finally invented it just now, today. Maybe we can patent it. So I run the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism, which is a multidisciplinary research center that really combines architecture, urban planning, media science, computer science. And the idea of the Leventhal Center is it's really through interdisciplinary relationships that we can create new innovations in cities. I'm excited to be the director of the Leventhal Center because I myself am very interdisciplinary. I'm trained as a geographer, an architect, an urban planner, and a data scientist. And I really combined my background in computation and design to create new strategies to create civic change. This is something I talk about in my book, Data Action. And data action is really a process for thinking about how we can use data for a tool for empowerment rather than oppression. So when I was reading the brief for this conference, this section really talked about the mass amounts of data that we now create in the world. It talks about how can we represent that information in a way that we can understand. And this is something I talk about all the time. Big data will not change the world unless it's synthesized into tools that have a public benefit. And one of the ways that we synthesize data is through maps. And I think that one of the things that maps can do is really reveal practices of power. And power is the ability to do work. And that's what maps do. They work. And I have this quote for Dennis Wood in The Power of Maps. And, one of the ways that maps work is, we trust them, we believe them, we believe a map to be true, we associate it with fact, right? And that makes it instantly work because we can translate data into a map to convince people of ideas. Maps also work because they humanize a particular situation or topic. They allow the person to exist in the space, in place and time, and to connect to that place. So they work in helping us connect also to the issues or problems. Maps work because they can create a dialogue. They allow us to understand data in a way that then connects us and allows us to generate different dialogues. So let's go to the next slide. But how do maps work? Which side of the force are they on? Are maps on the side of the good or on the side of evil? And I think that maps actually can work on both sides. And it's really important for us to remember that that power exists. Maps can be used as a tool to oppress just as much as they can be used as a tool for empowerment. And I think historically, maps have been used much more often as a tool for oppression. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is how we can turn data onto its head and use it for our tool for empowerment. So one of the things that I think is really important and one of the biggest powers that map has is the dialogue that it creates. And that dialogue to create civic change. So when I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, I thought I would talk about the many ways in which the maps that I have made have created that dialogue and then have created policy change. So I selected a number of different projects from my own work. And one of the things that I think I'll start with is one of my oldest projects. This project has close to 18 years of impact. And I think what it talks about is the lasting kind of quality that an image can have, right? Once we put an image out in the world, it can continue to create change over time. So what do I mean by this? Let's go to the next slide. In this project, I worked with Laura Kurgan, who's an architect, Eric Cadora, who's a policy expert, David Reinford, who's a graphic designer, and myself, a data scientist and a designer. One of the things that I think is really important is when you're working with data to create policy change and building these interdisciplinary teams. And in this project, we took this data set. This data set is a data set that is taken when people come into the prison system. So this is actually when you are checked into the prison system, where you lived before you went into prison. And we wanted to turn this data on its head to expose some of the hidden patterns in the criminal justice system in the United States. So what we did next is added up block by block all of the people who were in prison. Here we're looking at Brooklyn, New York. And these red blocks show where over $1 million is spent to incarcerate people from that one block. And the idea here is to understand the data in a different way. What does it cost to incarcerate, rather than think about the systemic issues at play that put people in prison? If you zoom in to those blocks we have highlighted in the previous map, you can see that it costs $17 million to imprison people from just these 17 blocks. On a financial scale, prisons become the predominant governing institution in these areas. Yet, they don't have proper education or job training programs or ways to alleviate the systematic associations with poverty that have created many of these reasons that people are within the prison system. So the idea of this project is also to think about one block. We can understand what the level of one block is and what $1 million on that block would be. Next. So we have a workshop where we show these maps in Brooklyn, New York, New Orleans, New Haven, Phoenix, Arizona, and then we have a workshop where we ask people from the community where those 17 blocks are and said, what if you spend just $1 million in these blocks? How could we alleviate some of the systemic reasons for people going into prison? And here we see urban planners, people from the community, policy experts. Next. And together we created a systematic understanding of the space and made recommendations for how we could reinvest in these communities. Next. This group actually came up with something called the dynamic franchise web, which was thinking about the multiple services needed. Many people in these communities don't have places to have childcare, but also have education. So can we have a childcare and education center? Next. The maps eventually ended up on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art, and you can see them here in the back. And the reason I bring this up is because one of the things that I try to do is really create that dialogue and bring topics to a broader public, right? So many people in the criminal justice system know the problem with mass incarceration, but how can we bring that topic to more people? So the map is seen on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art by a congressman who next actually used them in the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act of 2010 that allocated $25 million to reentry programs. So helping people who are coming back from prison and actually giving programs to them so that they don't return to the prison system. Obviously, $25 million is not enough if we see that those 17 blocks have 17 million, but it's a start. The reason I start with this presentation is we did this a very long time ago, and these maps have been used again and again in the current conversation in the US about defunding the police. Now, we're not talking here or advocating for defunding the police here, but what we're saying is reallocating money away from the criminal justice system into some of the issues that are systemic to poverty and associated with many reasons why people are going to prison. So people have reacquired these maps, used them for their own purpose and for their own advocacy. And I think one of the best things that we can do is when we make an image or a map or data or representation, and people leverage that data for their own needs. And so whether I agree with defunding the police, I do agree with reallocating funds away from the criminal justice system into the systemic issues. So this project has lasted over 18 years, and the maps are still being used to advocate for that kind of change. Next. The next project I want to talk about, and when we're talking about dialogue with data, is, shared data is essential for communicating the needs for policy change and generating a debate essential for that work. And data visualizations are really effective. So we talk about open data all the time and making data more accessible to the public, but not everybody can understand and comprehend that data set. And design allows us to understand that more clearly. Next. So in this project, again, I said it's really important in all my projects to build teams. I think building teams helps to connect the data beyond the policy arena that you're looking at. So here we work with the World Food Program, the Migration Policy Institute, the Organization of American States, and the Inter-American Development Bank to look at the issue of migration from Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. So in this project, we interviewed 5,000 households from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and we asked them questions about whether or not they had a migrant from their household. Next slide. Here you can see one of our World Food Program colleagues interviewing the households next. And the survey questions included things such as food security, migration, intent to migrate, motivations to migrate, cost of migration, and the amount of remittances. We had over 200 questions that are asked, so it's actually a very big data set, even though it's 5,000 people interviewed next. And we began with this group to create a report. And this is the kind of standard report that they typically have. And while we felt like the impact of our study was great, this kind of report was not communicated well. And in fact, migration has been an issue in the United States for such a long time. Why aren't these indicators becoming clear to the public? So we decided, and we really encouraged the World Food Program and the Migration Policy Institute to think about a new way to explain this topic at a congressional hearing that we would have in November of 2021. Next. And they took the leap of faith. We designed a website and interactive data visualization to be used at a US congressional hearing. So while the report was released and given to those coming to the congressional hearing, we also allowed everybody to view this link and use this link to explain our findings. So let's go through it next. So it's no surprise that violence, climate, food insecurity, and policy historically have driven immigration. Next. And we started the website by contextualizing the story of migration within its larger history, looking at the reasons that migrants come to the U.S. In the last 60 years. Next. And one of the major findings is that we had in the report, and we really wanted to change the way that this story is talked about and maybe bring it down to the cost. And one of the things that we found is the sheer financial costs that migrants take. Next. Migrants, we found in our study, spend $2.2 billion in just 1 year to migrate from Central America. This amount of money is close to the amount that the U.S. spends to keep people out on the border. Next slide. And yet, while migrants spend $2.2 billion to migrate, the U.S. benefits 73% of the U.S. agricultural labor force are made up of migrants. Next. But the U.S. Department of Homeland Security spent $2.9 billion to keep Salvadorian, Guatemalans, and El Salvador's out at the border. Next slide. And even though migrants take on all the risks to migrate, and the U.S. benefits, 57% of migrants never make it to their destination. Next slide. Yet, the countries in which they come from also benefit. What we found is that in this study, the majority of remittances go to provide basic needs. So previously, a lot of people think remittances go to adding a room to your house or adding infrastructure or roadways. At least in our study and the migrants that we spoke to, it was just putting food on the table. It was just putting clothes on the El Salvadorians back. And I think what's important here is providing a basic social service for the country. So just in El Salvador, 25% of the GDP comes back from remittances. So while the U.S. benefits, so do the countries in which the migrants come. Next slide. And, it's no surprise that we found that financial insecurity really drives migration. Next slide. And we created a data visualization that allowed us to understand the economics, motivations, reunification, security, climate, other. But one of the things that we saw when we were looking at the motivations is that it was happening at all income levels. It's often thought that the poorest income levels are the ones driven to migrate, but actually we're seeing those migration coming at all levels. Next slide. So ultimately, at the congressional hearings, one of our major findings was that you need to create more legal pathways for migrants. The risk and burden is all taken on by the migrants, but both countries benefit. Next slide. And that's exactly what 33 U.S. senators made a recommendation to the Biden White House, using our findings as evidence for their claims. So they wrote a letter to the Biden White House saying we need to create more legal pathways. Next slide. That happened in January. And in June, Biden did create more legal pathways for Central American migrants. So one thing people don't know is that there are many legal pathways for Mexican migrants, but for the Central American migrants, there have not been as many. So Biden increased the quota. Next slide. But I think what's important is, this project actually had the effect of changing policy, and we wanted to understand, did it have anything to do with the data visualizations? And so we asked people at the congressional hearing, what was the effect? And one of the things we heard again and again is that the data visualization allowed them to operate with the data themselves. They were able to find their own insights, to actually connect themselves, humanize themselves within the data, and trust it. And I think it's this kind of ability of data visualization and to create that trusting relationship, which allowed them to really understand the data in a different way. Next slide. So this is how we really take data to action. By building expert teams to collect unique data sets, quantify it uniquely, turn that data on its head and look at it through the cost, ground truth the data by working with the migrants, and open that data up through visualizations so that we can create change and iterate all along the way. Next slide. Since we did this project, the data visualization, we really also wanted a way to humanize the data. One of the things that we felt like is while we made this data visualization, the migrants weren't as connected to it as we would like. So since the release of the congressional report, we started to work with Honduran, Guatemala, and El Salvadorian migrants to actually make a tapestry of their motivations. Next slide. So we created money to represent the $2.2 billion, and each piece of money represented one of the findings. So here we're looking at the fact that U.S. depends on migrants and that 73% are hired crop workers. And this dollar bill represents clients. Then we looked at economics. Next slide. Reunification and that migration is not a choice. Next slide. The issues of remittances. Next slide. And then the risks that migrants take on and the security along the way. Next slide. And the migrants here wove the tapestry. And I think what's important here is they literally wove it with their hands and their own data, really trying to tell the story from their own perspective. Next slide. And they're using a Venezuelan money folding technique to actually create the tapestry. So if people are not familiar with that technique, the currency in Venezuela has gone down. People make bags and other kind of wallets out of that money. And we created ultimately a tapestry of migrants' hopes, dreams, and motivations to migrate. Next slide. The tapestry went on view at the World Food Program headquarters in Rome as part of their executive board meeting. The executive board meeting has ambassadors from all over the world that are looking to donate to the World Food Program. And one of the reasons they wanted to have this on view is to bring attention to the issue of migration in a year where things were happening elsewhere and they were worried about the focus on the needs of the migrants. The tapestry, in fact, allowed you to rip off one of the dollars and scan it on the computer screen here to see the individual story of that migrant. So each dollar bill represents one migrant's motivation. Next slide. So when you scan it on the screen, you can actually listen to that migrant's motivation, further humanizing the data visualization. Next slide. So one of the things that was really important about this was the dialogue that it created at the executive board meeting. And I think one really great way to understand that is the Honduran ambassador said, you communicated the migrant story with compassion, showing that many of them don't want to leave home, but feel like they have no other choice. The World Food Program also was able to use it to raise a lot of money for migrants. Again and again, the donors wanted to ask about the tapestry, asked about the migrant experience, and it created a different kind of way of understanding the situation, not within the idea of crossing the borders, but actually the needs and costs of the migrants and how we can take care of them. Next. All right, so the next project I want to show you is how we can expose hidden systems. Using data, we can come up with unique ways to acquire, quantify, and model data that can expose messages previously hidden from the public eye. However, we must remember to expose those issues ethically and responsibly and not to do harm, right? So this gets back to my earlier conversation, is that map can do both good and bad. And remember to work towards not doing harm. And you can see in the previous two projects, I always expose hidden systems, but this one is particularly unique. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide. So in this project, we worked on ghost cities in China. And if you don't know what ghost cities are, they are large cities that lie vacant, but there are also small residential developments within larger cities that are mostly vacant. This is a kind of pattern that China has exported all over the world, creating these luxury buildings that people don't move into. And data about these vacant developments are not available through the government because data is actually very hard to acquire in China. But understanding where these vacant developments are really important for understanding risk in the economics and of the real estate development in China. And so much is leveraged within that market. So in this project, we set out to create a model that helped us identify where these vacant developments are. And we thought thriving communities need amenities. We need a place to sleep, or a place to go to the grocery store, to the mall, beauty salon, a place to eat dinner. And if you don't have those amenities, you might be a ghost city. So we scraped data on amenities from the Chinese version of Yelp, and then we scraped data about residential developments from AMAP and Baidu, and created a 300 by 300 meter cell on top of all those residential locations. We then measured from the centroid of those residential locations the closest amenity, taking into account whether or not an amenity was something that people actually went to. So we looked at the reviews, and if you had a 0 review, it might not be something that you would actually go to. We took those distance scores and applied them to Hansen's gravitational model for urban accessibility, which takes into account if you live farther from a city center, you're more willing to travel a greater distance for an amenity. We created an amenity score for each one of those cells and then fitted that to the mean and created host cities. And we went and ground truth in Chengdu, Tianjin, and Xi'an. Next slide. So these are the ghost cities that we identified from our model in Xi'an. And here's what we found. Let's go next. Here we found places like this. Next slide. That look like they were developed 5 or 10 years ago. Next slide. And what the Chinese government would argue is that the financial and economics in terms of providing jobs is greater than the fact that anybody has moved here. So the fact that they were able to develop these places, provide jobs, and even though they lie empty, it's okay because of the job creation that's provided. Next slide. We also found areas that look like this. Let's go to the next slide. Largely developments that have been stalled. Next slide. Next to existing kind of ghost cities, next slide, that lie largely vacant. And these developments, the only people who were living in them were actually the former villagers that got access to housing. But one thing to note is a lot of times these ghost cities are completely sold. So that's actually the case of this development. Even though nobody lives there, all the residents are sold out because before the Chinese stock markets, the way to invest money in China was investing in housing. So part of the reason the ghost cities phenomenon has happened is because as people wanted to invest their money, they invested into these housing projects, even though maybe nobody lives there. Next slide. Then we found areas like this one in area 3. Next slide. Which was permanent communist housing ready, that were going to be ready for demolition and reconstruction. Next slide. And here you can see these empty buildings right on the waterfront that will soon be taken down. Next slide. Next slide. And then we found areas like this one. Next slide. Which are whole cities. Next slide. That were developed. Next slide. That nobody moved to. Next slide. This is actually the science center. And what has happened here is that, the government has created this idea to have a jobs market here, but then they never brought the jobs or the schools, and so nobody moved there. But the investment in this place is thought to be greater benefit to China as a whole. Next slide. But I think one thing that's important about this project is when we, and I don't know if you can click to make the video go. The video. There we go. Thank you. And this is really, when you make a model, such as we did, and understanding the Hansen's gravitational model is not something everybody can understand. So what we tried to do is to create a data visualization that would allow you to understand the model. So here we can see that red cell was far from a mall, from a school. Why did they get the high score? And the reason we wanted to create these visualizations that explain the model was not just to say, okay, we've identified these ghost cities, do you agree or not agree with us, but also to say, what can we do to actually improve these areas through urban planning? So how can we actually create amenities that will make these places livable, or places that people might want to live? And then we showed this data, next slide, to the Chinese government. So one of the things that I think is really important is to ground truth your data. So you saw we went and ground truth our results to see if what we saw was actually happening on the ground. But then we actually asked people that are connected to this work more specifically. And I think what was great about the data visualizations is that the government officials were much more candid when we talked to them. They could understand the model and they could see the phenomenon. One of the things that this planner has told us is, vacant developments are very controversial to local politics. And what she's saying is she knows that these developments should not have been made as a local planner, but she had little agency to make a change in that. Those kind of issues were coming from the top of the government to build, and she had to follow those directives, even though she knew people would not move to that area. Next slide. This planner was telling us how these decisions were mostly based on theory without the use of data. So kind of saying, he has the data to say that these are the places that they should be opening up development, but they're not being listened to. Next slide. This real estate developer told us that the burst of the real estate bubble will carry irreversible impacts. And one of the things he was really candid with us about was the process. So many of these ghost cities, the government and the bank are the same thing. So if a developer cannot pay back the bank, they can also not pay back the government, right? So one of the things that the government has been doing is opening up new land so that they give a loan to the developer. That loan then goes to pay back the previous development. And it's become a bit of a Ponzi scheme. And what was really interesting is exactly what he was talking about happened 1 year later in the Evergrande scandal in China. So that some of you guys remember, about 1.5 years ago, Evergrande went bankrupt, and it went bankrupt. It's a real estate development company in China. It went bankrupt exactly for this reason of the kind of creating of Ponzi schemes. So we had a more candid conversation about the economics involved in these ghost cities. Next slide. And really, we talked to academics as well, who told us that the mismatch between supply and demand geospatially is a big problem. So in this project, we were really attempting to expose this issue, have a conversation, and try to understand the economics of these cities in a different way. Next slide. So what we created was what I hope to is like a foreclosure map before the actual foreclosure crisis happened. Next slide. And one of the things that my research lab does is we really want to bring these issues beyond the policy arena. So again, we created an exhibition, and here in this exhibition, next slide, We connected the data to a map above that showed our ground truthing process. So when you click on one of the squares, next slide, you actually see that location in the coast city. So kind of trying to bring the debate around this issue to greater publics. Next slide. So the other thing that I want to talk about is the fact that maps can build trust. And one of the things that is really important in the work is this co-development of the maps and the data analysis. So in each project, we really build teams. And I think building teams is essential for creating the action you want to do with data, because each person in the team has their own network. And that broad network can bring out that information to diverse publics, but also really helps us understand the issue from a diverse angle. Next slide. So in this project, I'm going to take you to yet another world city, Nairobi, Kenya. And in many rapidly developing cities like Nairobi, the situation on the street looks like this. Severe congestion, problems. But one of the things, and I've been working in Nairobi for over 20 years, thinking about traffic and traffic issues. And when I got there, there was no information about the matatus. Those are these main buses, and they are the main type of informal transit in the city. And you know, they're really the public transport system. But there was no information about where these matatus went. And as I was trying to develop my transportation models, imagine not having data on 80% of the roadway, or 80% of the cars on the roadway. Next slide. So in this project, we're working with the Nairobi Computer Science Department. We developed an app to capture the stops and the routes along the matatu system. And I think it's really important that we worked with the computer science department in the University of Nairobi. We are MIT, we could obviously build with that app, but we wanted the app to be built by the local community so that that app can be used elsewhere, and that the technology and the technology know-how stays in Nairobi. Not only that, they helped us make an app that people would use. Nobody, like, again and again, we heard them say, we wouldn't do that, we wouldn't use it that way. So they helped us make our technology more usable. Next slide. We created the data in a standard format called GTFS. How many people are familiar with GTFS? Anyone? 1, 2. That's the better. That's a better statistic than I usually get. Usually there's only one person in the room, so this room is better. But you guys probably have all used GTFS. GTFS, when you're in Google Maps and you route yourself on public transport, the back-end data format is the GTFS format. So if you've ever tried to figure out how to get around on public transit on Google, you've used GTFS. Why do I stop and talk about this right now? I think what's important is whenever we're creating data, it's important to create it in a standardized format because it makes it instantly usable. There are so many open source softwares that use GTFS. It's not just Google Maps, but there's data and accessibility studies, and instantly your data becomes more than just a dot on a map, but something that has a meaning and can be more broadly used. Next step. So that's exactly what we did. We actually brought the community in Nairobi together. This is a local technology community. We explained what the GTFS format is, and we openly released the software. Next slide. And what happened is 5 apps were organically developed in Nairobi to use this data. And so apps that allow people to route themselves on the matatu, even a wave-like app that told about matatu traffic jams and other kinds of problems. Next slide. And the map eventually became the first map and first informal transit system in Google Maps. Now there are many other systems, but this was the first one. We negotiated that with Google. Next slide. So when you think about the GTFS, it's really just a text file. It's a ID point, a latitude and longitude, and it's streaming into the system. And here you can see as the data comes in, it's building the streets of Nairobi. But we wanted a way for people who don't have digital technologies to also access this information. Next slide. So we started to think about how we could represent this data in a format that might allow us to connect it more broadly to formal transit systems. So here we started to create a map that looks like something that you would see in New York, Paris, or Mexico City, London. Next slide. And ultimately created this map of the Matatu system. And then we asked the Matatu drivers, the Matatu owners, and users to help us edit the map. And here actually what you're seeing is they're instantly using it as a planning tool, because in the northern section of Nairobi, there aren't many Matatus, and there was a conversation of why that is. And this is the Matatu union helping us edit the data. But we didn't just do it with the drivers and the owners. That we invited people from the city, next slide, and actually invited people from the community to ask us if they understood the representational strategy of the maps themselves. So while we wanted to formalize the system, we also wanted to make sure that this kind of way of knowing is something that they would understand. So they helped us edit the maps. But I think one of the things that was really exciting is they did recognize its relationship with other cities, and it helped them to connect their city to those other global cities. Next slide. Ultimately, the maps went viral on the internet, and we had newspapers insert them. And one of the things that you can see here, next slide, is, Matatus are not, just in Nairobi. They exist all over the world. And since we've done this project, we've helped now 30 cities. The next slide, from Amman to Managua, have been inspired. Next slide. This is like digital. This new technology has some bugs, but we'll get there. Anyways, so from Amman to Managua have been inspired by our work. Next slide. And so now we have a network mapping these worldwide. I think one of the things that's really important is in our network for mapping this data, we don't go to every city, but rather we try to partner cities with each other. So we recently helped Santiago de Caceres in Dominican Republic, and they have people who have done this work in Mexico City, teach them how to make these maps. And so the idea is that the knowledge remains in the place, or knowledge from people nearby are helping them. And so that it's not always MIT coming to help, but rather we're helping bring that network together so people can get assistance from each other. So the other thing that I think is really important about maps is that they can change power dynamics. And building data helps us change the power dynamics inherently controlling and using data, while also having numerous side benefits such as teaching data literacy. So in this next project, one of the things that I think about is the fact that right now, Facebook, Google, and other have more data than governments once had. In fact, they hold in countries like Kenya, where I work often, they have more data than the government has, making them in some ways kind of a more powerful because they have more ability to talk about the resources and control. And I really want to think about how can we take that data back from Facebook, take the big data back, and use it for our own kind of power dynamics. So next slide. In this project, we worked with Facebook and the telecoms to get an aggregated data. And what you're looking at are people. If you complete each one of those dots is a person, and if I had data about how much they use the internet, how fast their download speed is. Do they have 2G? Do they have 3G networks? Like how fast is that network? And I aggregated that data into 150 meter by 150 meter grid cells. And this data came from a partnership that I made with Facebook's Data for Good group in order to show them and illustrate how they might change and use their data for something that has a benefit. Next slide. So we have things like user per capita, network diversity, character diversity, average signal length, download speed. We connected all these data sets to create what I call a city connectivity index, which would tell us in each one of those 150 by 100 meter cities how connected people were. Next slide. And then in order to really enrich the connectivities index, we also needed to have information about the land usage. And that data we didn't. So what I decided to do is actually try to use data that I scraped from Google Maps to do this. So like I did for Dan Ping, scraping the data here, we scraped data, next slide, using a grid of fishnet points, next slide, to collect all the Google places, next slide. And we found the businesses that existed in all of those places, next slide. And then created a place density and diversity index, next slide. We combined that data with images that we got from Instagram that allowed us to better understand the place as well. Next slide. And then ultimately created this land use map that we could connect with our city's diversity index. So here we're looking at yellow represents residential land, purple industrial, kind of red commercial, the kind of typical land uses. Next slide. And here, ultimately, we created a demand scenario for internet across Nairobi. And so it should come as no surprise that these very red spots are in some of the lowest income neighborhoods in Nairobi. Next slide. We applied the index to other cities. Here we tested it in Kampala. Next slide. And then ultimately, because Facebook has data everywhere, we were able to apply that index to many different cities across Africa. So let's go back one slide. Go back one slide. So one of the things that I'll just stop and note at this point is like what we really hope these maps would do is encourage both Facebook to increase connectivity. Because at that point, they're the really people who are providing internet infrastructure. What was disappointing is that they didn't actually want to do that. So they did want to create these maps showing data for good, but they actually didn't want to operationalize that because they were worried about the politics of them getting involved. And I'm still very disappointed in them. We can have a conversation about this afterward. They have the potential to do so much good by releasing these maps to NGOs, to multilaterals, to actually show where governments could increase access to the internet. So given this disappointment, I decided to take matters in my own hands. And in the next slide, I started to work with them in Kibera, so one of those red hotspot areas that you saw. And I worked with an organization called Kungui Design Initiative. Next slide. So Kungui Design Initiative is a design firm based in Kibera that really co-designs public spaces. So they're taking some of the spaces in the informal settlements that might have been trash dumped or used in other ways. And then they work with community groups to really co-design those spaces. So taking those 12 different spaces that Kibera had, we decided to use those to create a wireless network. Next slide. So we co-designed with KDI a wireless network that could be community owned, and then a data collection tool that could be community built. So also not only could they have wireless information, wireless access, but they could also have air quality sensors attached to those wireless networks to add Nairobi to the map. Next slide. One of the things that was really impactful about this project is we got the money right before COVID. So we already had the grants right like 6 months before COVID started. And so what we did is actually build this Wi-Fi network over Zoom during COVID to provide an essential resource to Cabrera and this community. And here you can see our team working with us on Zoom to actually build the network. And again, one of the things that's important here is that the local knowledge stayed there. And I think it was really great that we couldn't come in a way because really they had to learn how to build this themselves. Next slide. And so one of the things that we created are manuals for the development. These manuals are now being used in other community-owned Wi-Fi networks. Next slide. We also installed solar panels to think about electricity. Next slide. And then with the air quality sensors, we literally added Nairobi to the map. And so one of the things we often don't think about is the missing data that we have in the world. So, if we don't have data, especially air quality data, we can't argue for the needs of residents. And so by putting these air quality sensors in Cabrera, we were literally adding to that missing data and helping Nairobi connect to a more global market of data and information. Next slide. When people log into the wireless network, they actually see what their air quality data are. And these air quality information has been used by Safaricom to help donate new kinds of basically, they have something called M-gas, which instead of, because a lot of other reason the air quality is bad in Cabrera is from cooking with coal. And so this data was used to help M-Pesa figure out where to give M-gas, which allows people to get a little piece of gas cooking and they pay for that through their cell phone minutes. Next slide. So the value is not just the infrastructure development here, but the social development, the ability to co-design this network, to use the map, to investigate a place, but then use that investigation to give something back to the community and allow the community to give back to this global network and really change the power dynamics of who's collecting the information and who then can make decisions with it. So from Facebook to the community, we created something that we hope creates change. Next slide. So I just want to leave you with this final thought. All the projects that I've worked on, data can be used for good and bad. And as we're collecting more and more big data in the world, we need to create our own ethical standards of maps. And remember that data are people, and we must do them no harm. And we must seek to develop our own ethical standards of practice and call on others to do the same. Next slide. While I feel like Google understood that in a way, and if you guys are familiar with the case of Timothy Bruce, she was an internal critique trying to create ethical standards of practices with the inside of Google. But Google couldn't reckon with that, her findings, right? So while Google knew they needed to create their own ethical standards, they didn't know how to actually listen to their own conscience, right? So it's up to us to really kind of push and develop our own conscience and how data can be used and what are the proper uses for it. Next slide. Same thing happened with Facebook, right? There have been many internal studies within Facebook that showed that, some of their products were harming youth, yet they couldn't take their conscience and do something with it. So I want us to leave this idea that it's up to all of us working with data to create those ethical standards. And next slide, really take data to action and use it for empowerment rather than oppression. And one thing I want to also note here is, in many of the projects, we have to reckon with these own ethical practices ourselves, right? In the case of the Matatu, is exposing and making a map of the Matatu is going to do more harm than good? And in many cities that have asked us to work with them, we haven't mapped their informal transit system because it would cause negative effects by visualizing them. In the case of the Matatus, right, it helps us see them as a formalized system, get funding from multilateral agencies to help secure them. But in other countries, the very opposite could happen by visualizing that data. So one thing that's important is really when you're building teams to work with the data to understand those potential harms with the team. Same goes with the original project that I talked about at the beginning. Exposing where people live that are in the criminal justice system could have potential harm. And we debated that forever, the benefits and harm of that. But showing and exposing that we spent over $17 million in just one community and seeing that, spending that money could help alleviate some of the systemic issues, we felt like they were doing more good than potential harm. So I want to leave you all with that, thinking about how you can use data for action, turn around traditional data sets, take them and repurpose them for your own projects. Thank you very much.
Hola. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for your presentation. Just a quick announcement. A las personas que quieran hacer preguntas, por favor, pidan un pedacito de papel a los organizadores. Los vamos a apuntar y los vamos a hacer al principio de la mesa redonda que tenemos terminando las presentaciones. Llevamos casi media hora de retraso y tenemos a la siguiente persona conectada desde Dinamarca. Entonces, si hay una o dos preguntas, las leemos ahorita para Sara. Si no, las juntamos y las leemos al principio de la mesa redonda de las presentaciones.